In this episode of The Christian Philosopher, we're going to talk about the distinction between the act of faith and the habit of faith. What's up, everyone? Scott Sullivan here from the Aquinas School of Theology and Philosophy. We're talking about an important topic. I'm doing a whole series on what faith is. Super huge, big, important topic. Almost everybody in today's society misunderstands this. So you need to understand that it's not this sort of stupid, common street idea of believing things without evidence. That is not what faith is. We are going through some of the details on this in these videos, and you should know that classically speaking, there are entire treatises, whole books written on what faith is. Okay, so it's a complex topic, and I'm trying to simplify things for you. So in this video, we're going to talk about what the act of faith is. We're going to talk about how the act of faith is different from other forms of knowledge. Now, that may sound kind of surprising to some people. What do you mean, faith is a kind of knowledge? Yes, absolutely. Faith is a kind of knowledge, but it's different from other forms of knowledge. Then we're going to see how the act of faith is partially produced by the will. We're going to see how the act of faith is partially produced by grace. And then we're going to see what the habit of faith is. So what is an act of faith? Well, if you pick up an old theology manual, right, which I'm sure you guys do all the time. This is what I do. This is what you do, right? Sure. Yeah. When you pick up an old theology manual and look at the definition of faith, an act of faith, you're probably going to see something like this. It's going to say, the act of faith is the supernatural assent by which the mind, under the command of the will, moved by grace, believes revealed truths because of the authority of God's revealing. Let's read it again. The act of faith is the supernatural assent by which the mind, under the command of the will, moved by grace, believes revealed truths because of the authority of God's revealing. All right, so that may sound like a big fancy definition. Let me explain it to you in plain English, okay? When you believe things by an act of faith, what's going on is you are choosing to believe something that's true. So you make a choice to believe something is true because God has revealed it. But prior to your choice, God is working on you on the inside. His grace is kind of gently pushing your will in a certain direction. Hey, believe this, choose to believe this. And your will can say yes, or your will can say no. But if you make an act of faith, your will says yes, and then boom, you make that act of belief. So there's a lot of things going on here in our mind, so to speak. There's God's grace working on our wills, and then our wills can choose to make that intellectual act of believing or not believing. So if you want to understand in order kind of what's going on here, there's a lot going on in our minds. It's first of all God's grace. So God's grace is moving our wills. Hey, believe this. Our wills are free. Our wills can say yes, or our wills can say no. If our wills say yes, then we go ahead and then make that third thing an actual intellectual act of believing. So it's God's grace followed by our wills, and then if we choose to believe, there is that act of the intellect after that. If you still don't get it, imagine this. You are standing right in front of Jesus Christ himself, and let's say he performs a miracle for you, right? Let's say he's turning water into wine. So there you are, boom, right in front of Jesus Christ. He's turning water into wine. He is doing a miracle right in front of your face. You see the external miracle. You see it. And that gives you evidence that Jesus is who he says, right? He is God himself. You got evidence for that now. Look, dude, he's changing the water into wine. So you can see all this. At the same time in your mind, God's grace is prodding your will. Hey, believe this. Choose to believe this. And then your will can, in turn, accept that. And then you believe it. Okay, Jesus, I accept you as God. Boom, there it goes. So the act of faith happens when we choose to believe something because God's grace motivated us to do so, and we believe it on the basis of God's authority. So this act of faith is a type of knowledge. We are coming to know things, right? But it's different. It is knowledge, yes, but it's different than other kinds of knowledge. For example, the act of faith is different from philosophical knowledge. In philosophy, we can come to know things based upon our observance of nature, and we can use reason and logic and all that stuff, and come to know things based on our own powers. With the act of faith, it's not like that. We believe things because we can't come to know it on the basis of our own powers, but because it has been revealed to us by God. Also, the act of faith is a type of knowing that's different from scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is based upon, say, the hard sciences and experiments and observation and mathematical calculations, et cetera, et cetera. We come to know things on the basis of science through our own processes of reasoning, right? Not with an act of faith. We believe these things are true, not because we have discovered them in nature through a scientific experiment. No, we believe these things because God has told us. Also, the act of faith is different from a lot of things we know because those things are based upon probable knowledge, right? So a lot of the things we know, we believe them because of probability, especially human testimony, maybe historical testimony or courtroom testimony. You might believe a person is innocent or guilty, but you might have some kind of fears, like, man, I don't know if that dude's telling the truth or not. He might not be trustworthy. Not with an act of faith. It's different than that because God is always trustworthy. He can neither deceive nor be deceived. Also, as I've said many times, an act of faith is not like claiming to know things based upon religious feelings. Religious feelings are subjective. You can have these feelings in your heart, etc., and you can claim to know things on the basis of that. I don't think that's reliable, but let's just say someone claims that. That's not what faith is. Faith is not based on subjective feelings. It is based on the authority of God revealing something. And also, faith is different from the way we will know God when we get to heaven. So when you're in the presence of the beatific vision, you can see God directly. There's no need for faith. There's no virtue of faith in heaven, right? You don't have to believe things obscurely based on faith. No, you can know them directly by your direct observance of God in heaven. So faith is a kind of knowledge that's different from even the kind of knowledge that the people in heaven have about God. Another important point is that the act of faith is always moved by the will. So when we believe things on faith, there's evidence there, as I've been saying, but the evidence is not so overwhelming to compel our intellects. There's always, wiggle room, till you can believe or not believe. And so every act of faith, therefore, is preceded by choice. The will's involved. Hey, you can choose to believe, or there's wiggle room to not believe. And so this makes the act of faith also a moral act, one that's worthy of praise or blame. In other words, so an act of faith is a moral act because of this aspect of the will, and every act of faith is preceded by choice. Another important point is that faith is always preceded by grace. So we don't just make these acts of faith on our own. There's always God working in the background. So what happens kind of sequentially, or you can kind of say like in a certain order, right? God's grace first moves our wills. It's like, hey man, go ahead and choose to believe this. It pushes us in that certain direction. It doesn't overwhelm us, but God's grace gently pushes our wills to choose to believe His revelation. And then we can then in turn make that act of faith. So it's God's grace sort of working first, and then our wills can kind of choose to believe or not believe, and then we make that act of belief or not. This is important because what's happening here in every act of faith is that we are doing something that we could not naturally do. In other words, God's grace is taking our natural powers of the intellect and the will and elevating them to enable them to do something they would not be naturally able to do. That's why it says in the Gospel of John, no one comes to the Father by faith unless the Father first draws him. Now, another important distinction that we make when we're talking about an act of faith is what we believe versus why we believe it. We call this the material object of faith. That's what we believe. And then the formal object of faith, why we believe it. Those are two different things. There's what we believe and why we believe it. The material object of faith is what we believe. It's God's revelation. The formal object of faith is why we believe it, and that's because we believe it on the basis of divine authority. All right, so now that you know what the act of faith is, we say that it's different from the habit of faith. Let's talk about the habit of faith. First of all, of course, the habit of faith is a habit. So when you have a habit of doing something, let's say it's maybe you have a habit of eating junk food, maybe you have a habit of working out, whatever it is, it's a certain tendency or inclination to do that thing. It doesn't mean you're always doing that thing, right? So I have a habit of working out. I do it every morning, almost every day. I have a habit of working out. I have this tendency, this natural inclination, but I'm not doing it all the time. So the habit is kind of there and it's formed, and it's this inclination to do some act, but it's not the act itself. So you can already see the difference there between the act of faith, which is making that actual act of belief, and then the habit of faith, which is this tendency, this habit that's kind of there, inclining us to do a certain thing. Now, the habit of faith, though, it's different than the habit of, say, working out. I can build the habit of working out on my own. I can force myself to get up every morning and work out, and I do that enough times, and people say, you do that for like 3 weeks or so, whatever it is, right? I can make a habit of working out, doing it entirely on my own. You can't do that with the act of faith. With the act of faith, it presupposes that God infuses this virtue into your soul. So with an act of faith, God is infusing this virtue into your soul, and that habit comes from God. It's not something I can do on my own. The natural habits, of course, we ourselves can create, not the habit of faith. The habit of faith, it comes from God. So in theology, we say this habit of faith is infused into our souls at baptism. Baptism brings a certain grace, and with that grace comes this habit of faith. It's just brought into our souls by God, and it gives us a couple of things. First of all, it gives us that inclination, that disposition, that certain aptness to do certain things, in this case, make an act of faith. And then we can build on that through, better education. We can make frequent acts of faith over and over again, and therefore make that habit stronger. So there's a certain sense in which we can add to this habit, and that's where the importance of, say, Christian and Catholic education come in, because through that we can make those acts of faith and build on that base layer of the habit of faith. So we define this habit of faith as the supernatural and theological virtue disposing the mind to assent firmly to all revealed truth because of God's authority. So let's look at that definition. You can kind of unpack that a little bit. It's a supernatural and theological virtue. It's not something that we make up. It's a habit that's divinely infused into our souls from God. And it makes us, or disposes us, our minds, and it disposes our minds. It creates this tendency in our mind to assent firmly to all revealed truth because of God's authority. So we can see here that the habit of faith, it's a virtue. It's not just the simple act of faith by itself. The habit of faith is something that kind of stays in the soul. It has a certain sort of permanent quality to it. It's kind of always there, whether you're making an act of faith or not. Just like any habit, like the habit of working out. That habit is there, whether you're working out or not. What's the same with the habit of faith? It's kind of this permanent quality, if you will, that stays in the soul, that disposes our minds to make an act of faith. So we say that the habit of faith is supernatural, meaning that it enables us to do something we could not naturally do. It is supernatural. Why do we call it that? Well, because it's supernatural in 3 ways. Number one, the habit of faith is supernatural in its origin. Like I said, we can't make this thing up. We can't create this habit on our own like we could, say, the habit of working out. This habit is infused into our souls from God. So it's supernatural in origin. The habit of faith is also supernatural in knowledge. That is to say, when we know things by faith, we know things we could not naturally know otherwise. So, for example, the Trinity. We cannot know the Trinity based upon our own natural power. So the habit of faith is supernatural in the sense of knowledge as well. And finally, the habit of faith is supernatural in its motive. The reason why we believe these things on faith is because of something supernatural, namely God, who has revealed these things to us. So we say then that the habit of faith is a theological virtue. It's a virtue that comes to us from God. It helps us know things about God and helps lead us to God. And the last thing I want to say is that the habit of faith, it sort of disposes our whole mind. It affects both our knowing power, our intellect, and our choosing power, our wills. So what I mean is that the habit of faith both gives us things to believe as true, but it also gives us things to desire as good. So believing as true and desiring as good, that is the appeal to both the intellect and the will. It sort of, acts on the whole man, if you will. This is really important because any kind of education that's designed to increase someone's faith, say bring someone to the faith or even grow in faith, it should do two things. It should help us believe things that are true, but that by itself is not enough. It should also help us to desire things that are in fact good. Hey guys, just real quickly here, if you like these videos and you want to learn more about some of the stuff that I teach, you can visit my website, scottmsullivan.com. I have what I call the Aquinas School of Theology and Philosophy. We have courses in logic, philosophy, theology, a whole bunch of stuff. You can check it out. We have a free trial. It's available on my website. Again, check it out, scottmsullivan.com.